The sky hung heavy with silence that morning, not the usual peaceful quiet of the dust grove countryside, but a silence that pressed on the skin like grief itself. Thick gray clouds loomed over the golden grass, unmoving as if the heavens were holding their breath. Beneath that sky stood a gathering of mourners dressed in somber black, circling an old wooden cart that carried a rough-hewn coffin, no shine, no polish, just raw wood and raw sorrow. And standing before it, tall and unmoving, was Coalgrim, the massive black bull. He was mountain of an animal, muscles tight beneath a coat as dark as midnight, horns arching wide like the wings of fate. But what held everyone in stunned silence was the red flower delicately held between his teeth, a single crimson bloom. Coalgrim didn't move, didn't blink. He simply stared at the wooden box where Zane Ellory Briarhollow, the man many called mad, was now laid to rest. The town had long whispered about Zane. He was the old man who'd spoken to his animals like they were kin, who built fences, not to keep things in, but to let things grow wild. A recluse, a dreamer, a fool. But standing there, seeing that massive beast hold still with such reverent calm, not a soul dared say it aloud anymore. Even Quillen Duskrov, the town's stoic preacher, fumbled with his words. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the leather-bound Bible. Beside him stood Reeve Amara Thorniful, her eyes locked on the bull, tears welling not from grief alone, but from disbelief. Is he ... mourning? She whispered to no one in particular. From the crowd. Boaz and Leora Greydrift exchanged glances, uneasy. They'd lived next to Zane for 30 years and never once understood his bond with that bull. He used to say, Coalgrim had a soul, that he'd been born with it. People laughed. Not today. In the back stood Cassiel Bramblethorn, arms folded tightly, jaw clenched. She hadn't spoken to her father in years. Not since the day he chose a bull over a bloodline. At least that's how it had always felt. But now, watching Coalgrim stand vigil with more grace than most men she'd known, something inside her cracked. Behind her, Hawkwyn Coldrow whispered something to Eve, who wiped her cheek with the edge of her shawl. No one dared approach Coalgrim. No one dared speak too loud. It was as if the animal's stillness demanded reverence, or maybe warned of something deeper. When the time came, and the preacher's voice rose with final words about dust and eternity. The wind shifted. Coalgrim stepped forward. The rose fell from his mouth, landing gently atop the casket, and what he did next would tear open everything this town thought it knew about love, loyalty, and what makes a soul. Cassiel hadn't meant to cry. Not for him. Not for a man who'd chosen silence over fatherhood and poured his love into a beast instead of the daughter who once waited at the window every birthday. But when Coalgrim stepped forward and laid that rose on the coffin, something splintered in her chest. Not from grief, not exactly, but from a deep confusion. Because in that moment, through the thick wall of resentment she'd built over decades, she saw something in the bull's eyes, something that looked achingly like recognition. She turned away before anyone could notice her trembling lip. Only Rue Ashtel, her cousin, caught the motion. Rue, who had always defended Zane even when Cassiel would storm out of the house, too angry to listen. You okay? Rue asked softly, reaching out. Cassiel nodded, but her eyes were still locked on Coalgrim, now lowering his massive head beside the casket, as if trying to listen to something no one else could hear. He wasn't just present. He was grieving, ***, the preacher's final prayer ended, and the townspeople began to drift away, murmuring their condolences to no one in particular. Still, Coalgrim didn't move. His front hoof remained inches from the wooden box, as though he were guarding it. Even the gravediggers hesitated, unsure whether to begin lowering the coffin in his presence. One of them, Declan Ravenbrook, stepped forward cautiously, but paused when Coalgrim let out a long, low breath, not a snort, but something gentler, like sorrow exhaled. That Sael stayed behind while the others returned to their trucks and wagons. She hadn't spoken a word to her father in nearly 12 years. The last time they'd been face to face was in the same barn where Coalgrim had been born. A difficult labor. Blood in the hay, and Zane working feverishly to save the animal while Cassiel stood in the corner. 14 years old and feeling invisible. That night had shaped everything. It was the moment she stopped believing she mattered. Now. Watching Coalgrim gently press his muzzle to the edge of the coffin, she was no longer sure of that memory. Had he truly chosen the bull over her, or was there something she never understood? Then, without warning, Coalgrim lifted his head and looked straight at her, and Cassiel saw something in his eyes. Something buried, ancient, and hauntingly familiar, that made her knees weaken. She didn't know it yet, but that look would send her on a journey back through secrets long buried. In truth, her father had never spoken aloud. That night, the wind swept through the tall grass around the Briarhollow farmhouse, like it was carrying messages from the past. Cassiel stood on the front porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. The funeral was over, the body buried, and yet nothing felt finished. Her father's house, left untouched since the sheriff padlocked it a week ago, stood dark and waiting. She hadn't planned on going in, hadn't even wanted to. But Coalgrim's eyes wouldn't leave her mind. Something about them haunted her, like they were holding a message her father had never spoken aloud. She walked up the old, creaking steps, the key heavy in her palm. The sheriff, Merrick Crowridge, had given it to her after the burial, along with a dry condolence. "You might want to clear it out before the weather turns," he'd said. "There's a storm coming." Now, alone with the night, Cassiel turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door to a silence so complete it felt sacred. Dust hung in the air like frozen time. Inside, everything smelled of earth, old paper, and something warm, familiar. It hadn't changed. The same green armchair by the fireplace. The same worn boots lined up by the back door. And on the mantel, a small framed photo of Cassiel as a child, no older than 6, sitting on Zane's lap. She stared at it, stunned. She hadn't known he still had that. She hadn't believed he'd kept anything of her at all. Asterisk, asterisk, she wandered through the narrow hallway, her fingers grazing the faded wallpaper. In the back room, where Zane had spent most of his days, the floorboards groaned beneath her boots. She was about to turn back when one of the planks let out a different sound, hollow, like it had been lifted before. Her heart picked up. Kneeling down, she pressed her hand along the edge until it gave way, revealing a small space carved into the floor. Inside was a sealed envelope. Her name was written on it in her father's handwriting. Cassiel sat there in silence, hands trembling, as she opened the letter. The first line stopped her breath. "If you're reading this, then Coalgrim did what I could not, bring you home." She stared at the paper, barely able to hold it steady, and in that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of everything unspoken, Cassiel realized that her father hadn't just left behind a bowl. He'd left behind a truth buried deeper than any grave. Cassiel read the letter 3 times before she could move. The handwriting was careful but strained, like it had been written slowly, with effort. Her father had never been a man of many words, and yet here, on this single page, was more emotion than she'd ever heard him speak out loud. "I never knew how to love right, not after what happened with your mother," it began. "But you were never the problem, Cass. You were always the thing I couldn't hold because I didn't know how to keep from breaking it." She swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. The rest of the letter was fragmented, part confession, part apology. But what stood out most was the mention of Coalgrim. "He's not just a bull," Zane had written. "He remembers. He listens, and he's seen things no one else ever did." At first, it sounded like the ramblings of a lonely old man. But Cassiel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath those words. What had Coalgrim seen? Outside, the night had gone. Still, the farmhouse seemed to exhale, as if it too had been waiting for her to come back. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her jacket. There were no instructions, no will, no explanation of what he's seen really meant. Just silence and questions. Too many. She had come expecting to pack boxes, sell the land, move on. But now, every room in the house felt like it was watching her, asking her to stay just a little longer dot in the morning. She found Reeve Thorniful sitting on the front porch, sipping coffee from a thermos. Reeve had been her father's closest friend in the last few years. She didn't say much, but when she saw Cassiel, she patted the step beside her. He kept a lot inside, Reeve said softly. Didn't know how to put things into words. But he loved you. He just didn't think he deserved you after everything. Cassiel didn't ask what everything meant. Not yet. Did he ever tell you what happened the day Coalgrim was born? Cassiel asked. Reeve nodded slowly, then shook her head. Only pieces. Said it was the day he lost something, but gained something else. Never explained more than that. Later that afternoon, Cassiel walked out to the old barn. The doors creaked open like a memory being pried loose. Inside, Coalgrim stood waiting, not with the stillness of a statue, but with the quiet presence of someone who'd seen too much to speak. When he looked at her, she felt it again, that he knew, and that somewhere beneath all this dirt and grief, her father's real story was still alive, waiting to be uncovered. The barn smelled old wood, dried hay, and something else, Cassiel. Couldn't place, like rain that never quite arrived. Coalgrim stood in his usual place, near the far wall, unmoving. His black eyes followed her as she stepped inside, carrying nothing but the letter and 100 questions. She didn't speak, not at first. Instead, she sat down the overturned feed bucket the way she used to as a teenager, watching her father work in silence. I don't know what I'm doing here, she said softly. Her voice didn't echo. The barn absorbed sound like a secret. Coalgrim blinked once, slow and deliberate. He said you remember things, she continued, unfolding the letter again. That you saw what no one else did? I want to know what that means. Outside, the wind picked up, a sharp rustling through the trees, as if something old was waking up. She stood and wandered toward the far corner of the barn, a place she hadn't visited since she was a child. The floorboards there were stained, not just with time, but with something darker. She crouched down, her fingertips brushing the edges of a warped plank. It lifted easily. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and twine, was a small wooden box dot. Inside were 3 items. A silver necklace tangled with dried blood, a baby's knit cap, and a faded photo dot. The image hit her like a blow. Her mother, Isla Ravenbrook, younger, than Cassiel had ever seen her, cradling a newborn calf in her arms. Zane stood beside her, his face half in shadow, hand resting on her shoulder. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, the date, March 3rd, 1987, the day Coalgrim was born. And the same day Cassiel's mother had died. Cassiel sank to the floor, clutching the box against her chest. So that was the storm. That was the day everything changed. Her mother had died bringing Coalgrim into the world, a tragic accident during a difficult calving. Her father had never spoken of it, not once. Instead, he raised the animal as if it held her memory, or maybe her spirit dot, and now Cassiel finally understood why he couldn't look her in the eyes all those years, why he fed a bull like it was blood, why the silence between them had always felt like a graveyard.cs Siel sat on the barn floor for what felt like hours, the small wooden box resting on her lap. Her fingers traced the edges of the baby's knit cap, now stiff with age, her mind spiraling. This wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about guilt. Her father had lived inside this guilt every day since that storm. Every day since her mother died delivering the calf that would become Coalgrim. And Cassiel had lived inside a different kind of grief. The absence of a father who had never told her why he disappeared emotionally the moment she needed him most. She stood slowly, the photo still clutched in her hand. Coalgrim turned his head, watching her with quiet patience. There was something painfully human in his gaze. Not intelligence, exactly, but understanding. You were there, she whispered, stepping closer. You remember? The bull didn't move, didn't blink. But somehow, his stillness felt like an answer. He was the last thread between the 3 of them. Zane, Isla, and Cassiel. He had outlived them both, and in some strange, poetic way, carried the sorrow none of them had the strength to speak aloud. That night, Cassiel didn't sleep. She sat in her father's study, the letter on the table beside her, the old box open like a wound. The house felt different now, not haunted, but hollow. Like something had been buried inside it for too long, and now that it had surfaced, the whole place breathed differently. She found herself wondering about Isla, not the vague memory of a mother lost too soon, but the woman in the photograph. Her eyes were gentle, brave, in the way she cradled that calf. There was love. There. Real love. It made Cassiel ache in the morning. The door creaked open, and Trude Ashton, her uncle, stepped into the room with a thermos of coffee. He looked at her like he knew. He never stopped blaming himself, Trude said, placing the thermos. Down. She went into labor early. Zane tried to save them both. He almost did. His voice cracked. You were upstairs, sleeping. You never cried. Not once. Not until morning. Cassiel stared at him. Why didn't he tell me? Because you reminded him of her, Trude answered. And because he thought in some broken part of his soul that if he had to choose again, he wouldn't know. Outside, Coalgrim let out a long, low sound. Not pain, not rage. Something softer. Something that sounded like release. And for the first time in decades, Cassiel felt the weight of her anger begin to loosen. The morning light crept into the house slowly, casting long golden streaks across the floorboards of Zane's study. Cassiel hadn't meant to fall asleep, but sometime between the silence and the weight of the letter, her body had given in. When she opened her eyes, the house felt different. Again, warmer, almost as if someone had stoked a fire that hadn't burned in years. She rose slowly, her joints stiff, and walked to the old desk, tucked in the corner. The drawers were locked. All but one. The smallest, almost hidden beneath a false panel on the right. Inside, she found a bundle of pages tied with a leather strap. Journals. Not many. Just a handful of entries, dated sporadically over the last 30 years. She opened the first. The handwriting was unmistakably Zane's, but looser, more raw than in the letter. March 5th, 1987. It should have been a birth. That's what I keep telling myself. Just a birth. But I heard her whisper my name and then silence. Isla was gone, and all I had left was that calf and a child upstairs I didn't know how to love without her teaching to me. Cassiel's. Breath caught. These weren't the ramblings of a madman. They were the cries of someone who never healed. She flipped through the pages, reading fragments of years gone by. Cassiel's first steps. Coalgrim followed her like a dog. She laughed. It was the same laugh Isla had. And then one entry stood out. June 12th, 1999. She saw me choose the barn over her. She doesn't understand that it wasn't. About the bull, it was the memory. I stayed with him because losing him would have meant losing her all over again. Cassiel closed the journal, her hands trembling. All these years, she believed he didn't choose her. But the truth was crueler, and somehow more forgivable. He didn't know how to keep her without shattering under the weight of what he'd already lost. That afternoon, she walked back to the barn. Coalgrim stood by the open gate, as if he'd been waiting. She stepped inside without hesitation this time. I get it now, she whispered. You were never the replacement. You were the witness. She reached out slowly, resting her palm on his massive neck. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away, and for the first time since she was a child, Cassiel didn't feel like she was alone. In the story, the wind that evening had a different weight to it, heavier, electric, like the land itself was holding its breath. Cassiel stood outside the barn, her eyes tracing the horizon where dark clouds began to gather. Summer storms came fast in Duskgrove, and when they came, they didn't ask permission. She should have been worried about the rain, but something else stirred in her, an ache she hadn't felt since childhood. The kind that whispered, stay close, something's coming. Inside the barn, Coalgrim had grown restless. He paced, slowly, his hooves pressing deep into the straw-covered floor. Cassiel had never seen him like this. Not angry, but alert, almost agitated. She reached for his bridle, but he stepped back, snorting, eyes fixed on something behind her. That's when she heard it. The low rumble, distant at first, then growing. Not thunder engines thought a truck pulled up near the edge of the property. Dust curled behind it, and from inside stepped Boaz Greydrift, one of Zane's old rivals. He didn't look like he came to pay respects. Cassiel's stomach twisted. She remembered stories. Her father once accused Boaz of trying to sabotage a section of his fence after Coalgrim escaped into neighboring pasture land. There had been bad blood, old and bitter. Boaz approached slowly, eyes narrowing as he took in the barn and its contents. "Heard the old man left you the land," he said, voice hard. "Shame to waste all this on a memory." Cassiel didn't answer. Coalgrim stepped between them, his massive body a living barrier. Boaz stopped short. "Still guarding ghosts, huh?" He muttered. "That thing should have been put down years ago." Cassiel felt something flare hot in her chest, not fear. Rage. "He's not a thing," she said, stepping forward. "He's family. And if you ever set foot here again, you'll see just how protective we both can be." Boaz held her gaze for a long moment, then scoffed. "You sound just like your father." As the truck pulled away, thunder finally cracked through the sky. Cassiel turned back to Coalgrim, whose breath was shallow, eyes still trained on the road. She pressed her forehead gently to his, letting the storm wash over them both. And, in that moment, she understood not everyone wanted to bury the past. Some came back to claim what they thought still belonged to them. The storm rolled in before midnight. Sheets of rain whipped across the fields like punishment, and the old farmhouse creaked under the weight of the wind. Cassiel had barely slept, the image of Boaz Greydrift's face still burning in her mind. She knew that look. It wasn't finished. People like Boaz didn't back down, especially when they believed something still belonged to them, and her father's land had always been a point of bitter envy. Just after 2 a.m., Coalgrim let out a sound she had never heard before, a guttural, distressed bellow that cut through the wind like a blade. Cassiel shot out of bed and ran to the barn barefoot, heart pounding. The doors had been left slightly ajar, swaying with every gust. But Coalgrim wasn't inside. Panic surged through her chest. "No," she whispered, grabbing a flashlight and running toward the fields. That's when she saw it, orange, flickering, against the black of the night. Fire. A section of the western pasture was ablaze. Flames licking at the dry grass, feeding on the wind. And just beyond it, a shadow. Massive. Struggling. Coalgrim. He'd gone after something. Or someone. She sprinted toward him, dodging the edges of fire as best she could. The smoke burned her throat, her eyes watering, but she didn't stop. She reached Coalgrim just as he stumbled, a gash on his hind leg bleeding into the mud. In the distance, she spotted tire tracks leading away from the scene. Boaz had been here. She didn't need proof. The fire was his answer to her warning. "Easy, boy," she whispered, pressing her hands to his side, trying to calm him. Coalgrim's breathing was ragged, but he didn't back away. He leaned into her, trusting. She led him slowly out of the smoke, step by agonizing step, until they crossed the creek bed that separated the pasture from the farmhouse. Only then did he collapse to the ground, exhausted but alive. Cassiel fell beside him, coughing, her hands covered in ash and blood. The fire roared behind them, but the rain finally began to fall harder. Nature's fury and mercy colliding all at once. She looked at Coalgrim, lying there like a guardian brought down by time and betrayal. Her father had protected him for decades. Now it was her turn. The sun rose slowly over Duskgrove. Its light filtered through the fog that clung to the fields like a final breath. Smoke still drifted in wisps from the scorched pasture, but the fire had died out. The worst had passed. Cassiel sat on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the mist curl along the fence line. Inside the barn, Coalgrim lay resting, bandaged and calm, his breath steady. He had made it. Somehow they both had. She hadn't slept. Her body ached, her lungs still tight from smoke. But her heart, for the first time in years, was quiet, not numb, not closed. Just still. She thought of her father, of the words he never said and the ones he wrote when it was too late. She thought of her mother, whose memory had been buried beneath silence, guilt, and the shadow of a bull that wasn't. Just a bull, but a monument to everything Zane couldn't face. In the days that followed, neighbors came. Some offered help. Others just stared. No one could believe the fire was an accident, but Boaz had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but tracks in the mud and rumors in the air. Sheriff Merrick Crowridge opened a file but didn't hold out hope. Men like that burn everything behind them, he muttered. Still, Cassiel didn't care about justice. Not anymore. What mattered had survived the flames. She rebuilt the fence line with her own hands, repaired the barn door, washed the soot from Coalgrim's coat every morning, humming the lullaby her mother used to sing, the one she hadn't remembered until now. With each day, the land felt more like hers, not a burden. A birthright, a second chance. The kind her father never thought he deserved. 1 week later, a small group gathered again at the farm. No funeral this time, just stories. Shared in, soft voices over pie and coffee. Reeve Rue, true even Eve Coldgrove. They came to remember Zane not as the crazy old man with the bowl, but as a man who loved too deeply and spoke too little. And when it was over, Cassiel walked out to the pasture with Coalgrim by her side. She opened the gate, not to let him leave, but to show that he didn't have to guard anything anymore, that he could just be. He stepped out into the grass, slow and steady, lifted his head to the wind, and let out one long, deep breath. And in that moment, Cassiel understood. Sometimes the loudest forgiveness is spoken in silence.